Good evening, and welcome to NYU's Cross-Cutting Initiative on Inequality's new webinar series, From Here Forward. I am your host and moderator this evening. My name is Dr. Karen Jackson Weaver, and I am the Associate Vice President of Global Faculty Engagement and Innovation Advancement in NYU's Office of Global Inclusion. NYU faculty come from a wide range of schools and disciplines and work that encompasses a wide range of issues related to inequality. They have come together to explore how collaboration and focus can extend the scope and impact of that work in an effort to support strategies to reduce inequality. The CCII initiative is led by Dr. Sibel Raver, Deputy Provost, Dr. Ellen Shaw, Senior Presidential Fellow, and Dr. Michael Lindsay, Executive Director of the McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research. We are grateful to each of them for providing us this forum and for their pioneering research and leadership at NYU. CCII's aim is to reduce social and economic inequality by engaging in transformative scholarship and service. The top priority of CCII is to develop the next generation of scholars and leaders seeking to understand and combat inequality. To meet these aims, CCII collaborates with other universities and partners in government, business, and nonprofits to maximize student, faculty, and staff social impact and capitalizes on NYU's size, can-do ethos, global footprint, and urban lens to fight inequality, to combat its root causes, and to improve people's lives. Tonight, we are pleased to feature our conversation From Here Forward. NYU scholars discuss racism, past, present, and future. As we all know from recent events, lasting, meaningful social change often starts in times of crises. In these moments, we see the cracks, vulnerabilities, and injustices in our system. And far too often, we see too many of them. Our focus is for NYU innovators and leaders to engage in dialogues about their scholarly and community-based work with special attention to offering guidance on how we can actively pursue solutions to address inequality head-on during this incredible moment in American history. Before we get started with our panel this evening, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Caroline Dorson, Assistant Professor of Myers College of Nursing, who has been the lead organizer of the CCII webinar series. The CCII Twitter handle and new website are coming soon, so please stay on the lookout. And there are also plans for future webinars on areas including race, art, and activism, as well as leadership, advocacy, and organizing. We invite you to join the conversation tonight on Twitter at #NYURaceForward. Again, #NYURaceForward. And now, I'd like to give you context for this evening's panel. From here forward, NYU scholars discuss racism, past, present, and future. Our discussion this evening is with an esteemed group of scholars from NYU's faculty. First, we have Dr. Kimberly Johnson, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and affiliate faculty member at Wagner School of Public Service. We also have Dr. Thomas Sugrue, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History, and Dr. Arlene Davila, Professor of Anthropology and American Studies. Professor Sugrue will be our first speaker this evening, and he will set the historical context of the conversation, both around race and inequality, as well as the 50 years plus of US protests on racial injustice. And of course, we know when we think about protests in the US, it's very long, but that will be the focus for our conversation this evening. Professor Johnson will speak next and introduce the audience to her research on cities and racism, asking questions about how cities should run and who they should run for, as well as how to make them more inclusive and just. And Professor Davila will conclude our panel this evening with her comments on institutional racism across sectors, including the urgent need to diversify higher education. This conversation this evening will help the audience, we hope, think about how to shift the paradigm to make sure the changes we make are not just cosmetic and additive, but really serve to improve the mission and values and commitment to equity at each of our institutions. And now our first speaker, Professor Sugrue.
Thanks very much, Dr. Jackson Weaver, for the introduction, thank you and Professor Dorson and others for doing the hard work of putting together this very important evening. I want to begin by looking at the present, going back to the past and going back to the present, beginning with the extraordinary wave of protests around racial justice that have shaken the United States and the world over the last 5 or 6 weeks. In the immediate aftermath of the protests following George Floyd's murder, there were all sorts of comparisons that continue to come up right up to the present moment. Comparisons between the movements for social justice in the 1960s and today. Comparisons between the strategies of the movement then and now. And inevitably a discussion of the successes, the limitations, and the promises unmet of those struggles of the 1960s and beyond. What I want to do for a moment is talk about how today's protests differ from what happened in the 1960s, to talk about the unfinished legacy of the social movements in the 1960s, and then to think about briefly lessons for moving forward. The protests over the last several weeks have been extraordinary. This is the largest sustained wave of protests arguably in all of American history. We have seen unprecedented numbers, somewhere between 15 and 26 million people taking to the streets of American cities. Nearly 4,700, probably now, a few days after the last report where I saw those data counted, probably now close to 5,000 protests around the United States, happening in big cities like New York, in suburbs, in small towns, in nearly every state. The protests of today have many distinctive features in addition to their extraordinary size and their persistence and duration. They differ in really important ways from past civil rights and racial justice protests in their diversity. The protests of the 1960s for racial equality were organized, led by, and shaped primarily by African Americans. Members of other racial groups and ethnic groups participated, but generally in small numbers. They were not central. Yes, it's true that many white Americans looking romantically back to the 1960s believed that they too would have joined the protests around the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Or the protests demanding racial equality in the United States. But the grim reality was the vast majority of them were indifferent or hostile to the protests of that era. By contrast, today's protests have brought together African Americans, whites, Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, people of all different backgrounds in a display of diversity that reflects changes that have taken place in the United States over the last 50 or so years. Next, the protests today have been truly intersectional, bringing together calls for police abolition and racial justice, but also criticizing global capitalism, demands for trans and queer justice, critiques of the Trump administration and its various policies, including and especially around immigration, opposition to colonialism and imperialism, past and present, demands for environmental justice, and much more. Next, the protests today are also truly global, both in the perspective of so many of the participants who see themselves as part of a movement that transcends national boundaries, and their movements have now spread and influenced activists worldwide, including in places as diverse as France, where folks have demanded justice against police brutality, or in one of the countries with the highest rates of police violence and systemic racism in the world, Brazil, where major protests in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo have demanded that Black lives should matter there as well. Looking back at those protests and looking at today's protests, we need to understand the ways in which those who are taking to the streets demanding a change have in the past been intersectional. It was, after all, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that was led by the Reverend King and his colleagues in 1963. There were protests in the 1960s that mobilized around racial justice and the Vietnam War. But the connections that protesters in today's protests have drawn point to really important ways of rethinking the relationship between all sorts of issues that are generally considered separately, race and class, just to name one. The extraordinary wave of protests that we've seen over the last several weeks have broken out in part because of the unresolved issues of racial injustice in the United States and worldwide. And I want to focus on those for a minute. The civil rights and racial justice protests of the 1960s led to concrete changes. The very existence of a panel like this, drawing together diverse faculty, would not have been the case in 1960 or 1965. It would have been really out of the box. Indeed, the faculty at major universities like NYU and the student bodies were far less diverse than they are today, even if our institutions have a ways to go. Things have changed. But a lot hasn't changed, and the protesters have pointed out many of those limitations or pointed out the unfinished business of the 1960s protests and beyond. Police violence, obviously, is still a major problem. This has been a demand of advocates of racial justice for most of the 20th century, well preceding the 1960s, and it's one that has been met generally symbolically by police departments, law enforcement officials, and elected officials. Next, the protests of the 1960s raised questions of separate and equal housing, education, and work, but those still remain largely unaddressed. America is highly residentially segregated by race. America's schools, including New York public schools, are among the most segregated in the United States and have grown resegregated since the 1980s and 1990s. Labor markets are still segmented. Disinvestment affects communities of color, and there are persistently high rates of unemployment and persistently high disparities in health that affect communities of color. Consider George Floyd, an African-American living in Minneapolis, a city that prides itself on its racial liberality, but who nonetheless found himself the victim, not just once, but in his past history as well, the victim of police violence. He was marginally employed as a result of the challenges that African-Americans face in labor markets in the United States, decades after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He had suffered COVID, and indeed the disproportionate impact of COVID has been borne by communities of color, particularly African Americans and Latinx Americans. The 2020 protests have raised all of these issues, embodied in George Floyd, unresolved from the protests of the 1960s, in high relief. So where do we go from here? I will only briefly make a few suggestions because I know we'll have more time later. First, protest is necessary but not sufficient. We need to build the institutions necessary for accomplishing major political change. Secondly, we need to build on what are the novelties, the important dimensions of the 2020 protests. That is, continue to build on the diversity of those who have participated and the intersectionality of the issues that they have raised. It is not possible to solve the problem of police violence simply by reforming police departments or even abolishing them. We need to think about the larger context of segregation and inequality on multiple vectors that are the context for what happened to George Floyd and many others. Next, we need to think about marching on our institutions, particularly the political system. We need to transform or build on the energy, the rage, and the hope of the protests to work for systemic electoral change. And finally, we need to sustain the protests. As big as the protests of 2020 have been, they are but a starting point for what will by necessity be far more sustained struggles in order to address the many intersectional issues that we still face today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sagru. And before we turn it over to Professor Johnson, I just want to thank all of you again for joining us this evening. We have several hundred people on our call this evening, and we are so thrilled that you were able to join us. We invite you to join the conversation on Twitter at hashtag NYU Race Forward. Again, hashtag NYU Race Forward. And we also invite you to please send in your questions in the Q&A. As you listen to our faculty and our scholarly experts, we want to hear the questions that you have as they evoke a number of provocative ways of thinking about their research. So please do send your questions in through the Q&A. And now we will turn the microphone over to Professor Johnson. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for having me here. I want to start off with thinking about the last 20 years or so of New York City, but I think we can maybe expand this to lots of other cities, which is the sort of revival of cities has really rested on, in many ways, the marginalization or erasure of Black and brown peoples. So the neoliberal city, which is a city in which certain populations, what some would call the professional managerial class, are highly valorized, in which city services and city government sort of extends sort of an helping hand towards those populations, while at the same time working against the sort of long-term interests of Black and brown populations. And what I want to say is working against, I want to be very clear about what I mean by working against. By working against, I mean really a whole host of policies that have been used to either marginalize Black and brown people within cities, and by cities, I mean not only cities, but metropolitan areas, cities and suburbs, but also in some ways to sort of evict them. So here I'm thinking about schools and housing and transit, food deserts, a whole host of things that have been used to really minimize and erase, if you will, the right of Black and brown people to live in the city. So if we look at New York City, what do we see? We see in some ways the spectacular growth of the city. So last year, or last summer, you see the realization in many ways of a new kind of city, Hudson Yards. It's just sort of brand spanking new. But it is a city, it's a portion of the city that really, in some ways, does not invite those who are not deemed a part of that city to be involved in the city. It is a city, again, for a certain kind of elite. I think that what COVID has, the COVID pandemic has revealed, and certainly the protests and uprising that has happened in its wake has revealed, is that this neoliberal city just doesn't work. It doesn't work for the vast majority of Black and brown people. So one of the things I want to think about is, and talk a little bit about, is how did we get to this point? And what I really want to start with is this moment in 2000 or so, where there is a growing protest movement against police brutality, set off by a number of deaths by policing, including Abner Louima. One of the things that happens is that 9/11 happens, and this protest against police brutality, police killings, kind of goes into a little bit of abeyance, but it doesn't end. Certainly people are still organizing around it. One of the things that happens under the Bloomberg administration is that stop and frisk dramatically increases. I mean, just to unprecedented levels. And I think this really dovetails into the notion of the city being really remade into a city not for Black and brown peoples, but really a city that is for, again, a certain kind of elite. And so one of the things I think that we saw happening during the pandemic that we're still sort of in, is that these layers of inequality that have built up over the last decade or so reached its breaking point. Certainly we could see that the employment situation in New York City was a stratified employment situation in which increasingly brown and Black folks were linked to and kind of embedded in and confined to irregular employment, gig employment, or low-wage employment, the very types of positions that in fact became incredibly important for helping the city make it through the dark days of the pandemic. Yet these are the same people who really have a hard time finding affordable housing, right? So if we think about housing in New York City, again, during the last 2 decades, it really has been a housing policy that has been focused largely on securing housing for the middle and upper middle class, as well as the sort of the wealthy, and has not really paid much attention to providing not just affordable, but really attainable housing for people who are working these kind of low wage, irregular wage, or gig employment jobs. To the extent that there was a housing policy, it really was sort of an afterthought. And in some ways it was really problematic. And here I'm thinking about the so-called poor doors, in which affordable housing was afforded to individuals, but really on this kind of strange, unequal way, i.e. really literally the back door, a separate entrance into these this sort of housing that was really that really was constructed for a wealthier class. I also want to think about schools, right? So we have a situation in which the vast majority of students in the New York City public school system are Black and brown students. But where we see, not necessarily in New York City, but in also cities as well, as we see the vast majority of school closures, opening up of charter schools happening in these neighborhoods, while schools that are geared towards white middle class or upper middle class students tend to be framed as magnet schools, or they have gifted and talented programs. And so there's a really kind of problematic and deeply unequal educational system that is layered on top of a deeply problematic and unequal housing system that is also layered on top of a deeply unequal and problematic health system, right? And this is what we saw during the COVID pandemic, that the vast majority of the deaths that were happening in New York City were elderly, but also in addition, they were Black and brown folks. And you can see this in these maps of the city, that these neighborhoods were highly impacted. And finally, I want to say that safety, meaning the ability, the right to be safe in one's person, was also, I think, dramatically affected by this neoliberal moment. That is, there was really a sense that some people, quite frankly, had more rights than others. Quite frankly, more people had the right to breathe than other people. And I think we finally saw this, not finally, of course, we've always been finally seeing this, but I think we saw this in that moment where people started emerging out of their apartments, venturing out into public, and we saw this very, very unequal, highly unequal policing of quote unquote social distancing, that Black and brown communities were targeted by the police and white communities simply were not. Black and brown communities had a higher percentage of parks being closed, white communities did not. And I think that what COVID revealed really was that the system simply cannot be sustained. It simply cannot. And so I think what I want to think about and have us think about going forward is one of the things I've gotten from my research is that, particularly if we're thinking about the 1960s and 1970s, is that people on the ground, people in communities have come up with lots of really innovative ways to make their cities and their communities work better for them. And I think if we think about programs like school breakfast programs, freedom schools, all these sorts of innovations to achieve the goals of these communities for a safe and just life, that we can really learn a lot from these earlier practices. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I have 8 minutes and I think I used it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Johnson, for that informative presentation. And before we move on to Professor Davila, I just want to highlight that we have several hundred people on the call right now. We have people continually dialing in, and we're excited that you're joining us this evening. We want to invite you to send us questions in the Q&A component of the Zoom chat feature. So please check the Q&A. And if you have questions that arise, we invite you to send those in because we're going to open it up to Q&A as soon as Professor Davila finishes her presentation. We also want you to join the conversation on Twitter at hashtag NYU Race Forward, hashtag NYU Race Forward. And so now we will have our final panelist, Professor Davila.
Myself. Okay, better? Thanks for the organizers for the opportunity, and Karen Jackson, our moderator in particular. I'm going to change a bit to the contemporary moment, and I've entitled my comments on ethnic studies, the vibrant and decolonial path forward. In the midst of this social movement to fight anti-Black racism and how entrenched it is in society that we're living through, when I was asked to participate in this panel, I hesitated unless Black panelists were front and centered, believing this is not the time for anyone to take on space unless Black voices are heard. Yet this concern brought up a number of contradictions. First, for adding to the arduous diversity labor that Black faculty in this university and everywhere have historically taken on, or more appropriately, have been forced to play in the predominantly white institutional spaces in which they work. Most troubling, it brought to the fore how impossible it is to center Black voices when there are no Black colleagues among us. Indeed, according to the 2017 New York University Ad Hoc Diversity and Inclusion Report, 3% of the tenure-track faculty at NYU are Indigenous, 3% Latinx, and 4% Black. Unfortunately, these numbers are quite representative of most research-run universities, and most problematically, they have remained pretty much unchanged for over a decade, raising questions of how do we move forward when universities, and in fact most arts, culture, and knowledge-based institutions remain such white institutional spaces. In my 10 minutes, I want to propose a rigorous hiring of Black colleagues as central to a wholehearted diversification of all institutions. And I also want to suggest that investing and nourishing in ethnic studies provides the most vibrant and decolonial response. I address these issues not as a historian, but as an anthropologist and Latino studies scholar whose work examines the political economy of culture, focusing on arts and media industries, trying to understand the racialization and inequalities involved in the commodification of representation and mainstreaming of culture. You see this in the context of US Latinx, where media representation have consolidated the so-called Latin look, not too dark, not too white, but closer to white, erasing Black and Indigenous Latinx people. In particular, Black Latinx, who make up 24% of the US Latinx population, are nowhere to be seen in popular representations of Latinx culture, feeding onto their historical exclusion. For evidence, all you have to do is look at the many Latinx organizations with only white Latinx leadership, or realize how few Black and Indigenous Latinx people you see in television shows, in art exhibitions, as university professors, and so on. These erasures are not only a matter of representation, they have political and economic consequences too. In fact, most research documents that it is exactly the Black and brown within the US Latinx population who have historically been most discriminated in a context where race and color are the #1 predictor of income, social inequality, and even health across Latinx groups. In sum, this current reckoning about how a legacy of anti-Black racism has affected all of our groups, institutions, and society at large is way overdue, urgent, and necessary. It is forcing all of us to look around us and ask ourselves serious questions about who is in leadership positions, who's behind the camera, who's writing and constructing narratives, as well as who is not and needs to be. We see this reckoning apace in institutions as diverse as museums, to the media, to publishing, to journalism and finance, and in hashtags such as Black in the Ivory, Black in STEM, Black in journalism, Publishing Paid Me, Change the Museum, among others, where people of color are speaking out openly about their intimate experiences of racism within these industries, with Black professionals taking the lead. Most uncanny is seeing comments from people working in these industries where positions of power remain over 80% white, and in some instances like finance and publishing closer to 90% white, who were totally unaware of these experiences, So it's exhausting and frustrating. White people dominate these industries, yet how can they change what they don't even see? How do we confront the white privilege that is normalized when we don't have Black colleagues in charge of the narratives, of decisions, and conversations around any topic? Obviously, the only answer is to change the demographics of our industries, and to do so immediately, because business as usual will not do. Today, we're learning that it is not enough to claim that we're anti-racist because we care about diversity, or work with fill in the blank with any other non-Black minority, or have recruited the most fill in the blank any other non-Black minority, or because we ourselves are people of color. It is not enough to be proud of our intentions and commitments to diversity while no one takes responsibility for how is it possible that there are consistently so few Black students and colleagues in American universities forever. Foremost, we must admit that, in fact, many diversity initiatives and vague appeals to people of color and inclusion may have contributed to anti-Blackness in our own institutions by hiding and erasing the lack of Black faculty and professionals in positions of power. Today, we realize that decades of symbolic celebrations and appeals to diversity have left our institutions structurally intact in the composition of their staff. And this is where I'd like to end by stating that the answers to this necessary reckoning will not be found in traditional disciplines or within the same institutional structures that have remained white dominated for decades. Research shows that pipeline issues and excuses such as there's no good Black professionals in this and that is because of narrow definitions of merit, quality, and credentials that support hiring those who like us or have similar. Instead, we must turn to the ethnic studies more broadly, which for decades have been correcting the diversify the margin of the traditional disciplines. It's not a coincidence that two of the few Black and Latinx faculty at NYU that are speaking in this panel were promoted at Social and Cultural Department, interdisciplinary department that houses some of the ethnic studies units on campus. Because the fact is that fields have to be on for decades, that the issue of diversity has been acknowledged as a problem on this campus and beyond. In my last some politics, which is coming out later this month, Duke University Press, I examine how the field of Latin art nourished by interdisciplinary at the margin of the discipline of art history that has remained steeped in a Eurocentric canon that has left little room for anything European, much less for anything ethnic, so that you're more likely to see a course on Latin American art, but Latinx art. Stakeholders on Latinx art that I interviewed for my book were not hiring art history departments where they could train future generations of scholars. They work independently, liberal art institutions, and oftentimes in ethnic studies departments, where they cannot train scholars that would be recognized as art historians. The pattern continues then. You find the same pattern in my own discipline, anthropology. Since 1973, the first report of minority anthropologists and the discipline found that minority anthropologists were not being hired within disciplinary departments. And as a result, they were unable to change and renew a discipline that continued to marginalize them. However, it's important to know that all of these scholars and voices and professionals have in fact continued to work and thrive. Some inside the academy, others outside it, and always they're inspiring generations of scholars, oftentimes exactly because they were encumbered by the limits of white institutional disciplines. I bring to mind the work of Miriam Jimenez Roman, one of the founders of the Afro-Latinx Forum, who was celebrated last week, who built the entire field of Afro-Latinx studies at the margins of any discipline, even lacking a university appointment. Those as universities add a role that forward well to look at race and art, where critical race theory, decolonial approaches, and public humanities approaches were never a fact, but were the very reason for being and the starting point for all of the scholarship. In these spaces, scholars are increasingly proud to be multidisciplinary. They're innovating. Their syllabus and curricula were always diverse. As we move forward, We can learn from these spaces. We should hire the young professionals that are being now nourished in these spaces. In fact, all professional fields and institutions should do too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Davila. Just so that you know, we certainly enjoyed your presentation. I think there were some internet connection challenges. So we want to make sure that as you do your Q&A, there are a couple of key points that you highlight from your presentation. And if you can integrate that in to the conversation, I think the audience would really, really welcome that insight. And we have a lot of questions that are already in the queue. We have several hundred individuals on the call. So we're so delighted that many of you took time this evening to join us and be part of this conversation. And I'm going to start it off with one of the conversations that's already in the queue. And this is for all of our panelists. And the question actually fits in very nicely to the theme and the focus of what we want to really discuss this evening. I think many of you are here on the call this evening, and the whole premise of this webinar really is to devote special attention to offering guidance on how we can actively pursue solutions to address inequality head-on during this incredible moment in US history. And Professor Sugrue talked about the historical landscape and protests and how that really has fed into much of what we see in this contemporary context. And Professor Johnson, you highlighted the important and the unique nature of cities, and particularly how we can think about the impact of COVID-19. And Professor Davila, you highlighted the importance of prioritizing the diversity of faculty, especially looking at the huge disparity and marginalization that we see of African-American faculty and the real commitment that institutions need to take to prioritize hiring Black faculty. And I want to know, as you all think about your research and the work that you've done, if you can share one anti-racist takeaway lesson and or policy recommendation that emerges from your research that you'd like to share with our audience this evening. And so Professor Sugrue, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Professor Johnson and Professor Davila.
Thank you. I would say one of the most hopeful examples of anti-racism around the United States today is the way in which diverse coalitions led by people of color have begun challenging established elected officials and pushing for change through municipal and state governments, and sometimes even higher offices as well. Here in New York, of course, there are good examples. Philadelphia has seen an extraordinary insurgency, including taking over city council. Jackson, Mississippi has been a crucible of innovation led by African-American activists combining demands for racial justice and environmental change. This is happening globally as well. So for me, that is one of the most hopeful and positive manifestations of this fortune.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Johnson.
I think I would say that one of the big policy lessons that I've drawn from the research that I've done is to really, in some ways, listen to the people, right? That the people who are on the ground, the people who are in these communities, they know what they need. They know what they would like. They know where they would like to go. So I think for me, the issue is how do we recenter those people? I don't say those people, that sounds terrible. How do we recenter Black and Brown voices into policy and really listen to them? And if we don't see Black and Brown voices, or if we only see some Black and Brown voices, who are we missing and how do we include them? And I think that's really the important thing, is that you have to include everybody in this conversation, even if it's uncomfortable for those who are in power. Because I think when you do that, the policies, the innovations that work for those who really truly are in need often are the innovations that work for everybody. And that once you empower those who are marginalized and oppressed, in fact, it turns out you empower a lot more people.
Yeah. Can I speak?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yes, thank you so much, Professor Johnson. Professor Davila.
Yeah, I could not agree more with Kimberly, what she just said. Basically, my entire 8-minute talk was basically about that. It's really about really turning around our hierarchies of value, right? We tend to sort of like go to like the traditional disciplines, the big institutions, the people that have the pedigrees that we recognize as valuable, and we're totally missing out especially because oftentimes those more professionals never took a course in critical race theory or ethnic studies, or have the sensitivity and the kind of critical race knowledge to center, right, the Black and brown communities that they need to serve. So I think that it's a moment of really rechanging how we think about leadership, how we think about our institutions, and really hiring and investing in new generations, and particularly Latinx people of color in generally. I just want to say that we are in the process of hiring at the Latinx Project. We advertised a position last week, and in less than a week, we have received almost 145 CVs. And they were amazing, each one of them. So if there's a museum out there, a cultural institution, or any other institution that does communication, media, or art, and says they can't find Latinx talent, they're lying. Because the incredible talent in the CVs that we're seeing. So that's kind of the key element, that the answer is around us. We just have to be willing to open the door and say, I'm not going to take space. Let somebody else take that space. And that space is got to be, the people, the Black and brown youth that are reshaping and reimagining the future. And I think that it's going to take a lot of us stepping out and giving the microphone and giving opportunities to those generations that are ready to step up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Davila. And we have a number of questions that are pouring in related to exactly what each of you have raised. And I think there's some nuanced ways of thinking about this that you all have raised. And Professor Sabru, you talked about this being kind of unfinished business from the 1960s. And Professor Davila, you just highlighted the importance of the hierarchy of values and how there has to be a paradigm shift, right? We can't do business as usual. That's not going to work. And so one of the questions that we had that came in really highlights the fact that we're in a rare but glorified moment in time when change is not only in the air, but it's actually in the hearts and the minds of many people. It's a right moment. And the question that was posed by one of our audience members says the following: I'm very interested in how we move forward from here. What do you think is the most important question that we should ask of each other to begin the conversations around changing our communities? What do you think is the most important question that you think we should be asking each other to begin the conversation around changing our communities? And I'm going to open it up to all of you in whatever order you feel is most comfortable. Anyone want to jump in?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think about being in New York City in March and April during this moment where everyone's sort of inside and trying to stay safe, and other people have to be out. And I would be on a number of Zoom calls, and the question would be asked by, say, the moderator, are you safe? What can we do? What can happen to help make you safe? And I think for me, that's the question I would ask. Are you safe? Are you secure? What can we do? What can we as a community do to help you feel safe and secure in your body, in your community, in the world?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Professor Davila, Professor Sabru, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I guess I will say, I'll repeat a question I asked during my presentation, which is, this is a moment to really ask ourselves rigorous questions about who is in charge of, right? Who is around us? Who is teaching? Who is in the decision-making power? If we're in committees, if we're hiring in any space, who is in charge of the conversation and who's not and should be? Who needs to be? I think that it's a moment where it is unacceptable to do business as usual and not look around if we have a panel and there's not, if it's not like at least 55% diverse. I mean, like at that level, right? Because I think in the past we have gotten used to this kind of like tokenistic idea, right? And you know, when you think about a city like New York City, where it's more than half of New Yorkers are people of color, when you consider that 18% of the US population is Latinx, right? But also to think about diversity within diversity, which I said, right? Because within the Latinx community, you know, Latinos are not a race, they're an ethnicity. So we have to be very attentive to really look at the Black Latinx in our community, the indigenous Latinx in our community. So it is really a moment of really ensuring that the solutions, that the questions, the solutions, and the people that are leading the conversations and the solutions look like the people, like the United States looks like, right? And that look like New York City. And I think that we're at a moment when this incredible racist xenophobia around, who we are, who is the United States, and this fear. Let's face it, people of color are the majority and will be. So I think we do need to get used to ensuring that our institutions and everything we do look like the United States today, and that Black and brown voices are centered, not relegated or tokenized, because I do think that Black colleagues have been leading this conversation. Black urbanists have been writing about the cities for forever. So I think that we just need to listen and read and learn from people that have been saying this is not a new situation. In other words, we just need to stop marginalizing the voices that can lead us because they have been writing and experiencing these issues and have solutions. So we need to start there. We need to start by changing the conversation and ensuring that we diversify the people that are in decision-making powers and able to transform society. Sorry
Great.
for being long-winded, but
No, you got it in. That's great. Professor Segru, you want to chime in here too?
Sure. When I teach urban policy or politics or social movements, I always ask my students to consider this question: who benefits from a public policy? Who loses and why? And I think it's high time, building on both Kim and Arlene's comments, it's high time that we begin to reshape policy from the vantage point of people of color, people who are in precarious working class jobs in the large service sector that don't pay enough for folks to make ends meet. People who are living in precarious housing and are paying sometimes half or more of their monthly income on housing costs. Folks who face the knee of the cop or the point of a gun from a police officer. Our public policy in the United States for my lifetime really has disproportionately favored the haves over those who have continued to lose. And we need to turn that on its head. And that requires changing our institutions, yes, but it also requires getting onto the streets and mobilizing and organizing at the grassroots. Change is going to have to be on a massive scale. It can happen in our departments, it can happen in our university, but it also needs to happen on a far wider scale if we're going to really get at the fundamental question: who benefits, who loses, and begin to change those equations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we have a question now, actually two questions coming in, and they're really related. And it's about really the fabric and the cognizance and consciousness of community. And one question that we have, and it's a two-part question, and I'm going to put them together, and I hope both of you will, or I hope with both of the questions, you all can give us some thought and really interrogate what they mean. The first question really centers on how do we bring about consciousness raising and action in majority white communities? How do we bring about consciousness and transformative action within majority white communities? And another question that is very similar talks about changing the nature of urban communities, right? How do we address the challenges that come along with creating generational wealth, some of the conditions that exist in the city in terms of economic and health disparities? How do we address those very real issues in ways of engaging communities that have historically been marginalized? So you have a two-part question that, the question of community, but the question of looking at some of the systemic, institutionalized ways of thinking about community and how it plays out in the white community and what can be done there. And then on the other side, when we think about urban communities and communities of color that may not have access to wealth and resources in the same way, what are ways that we can think about paradigm shifts and transformative change? And I'll open it up to all of you. Anyone want to jump in? Don't be shy. Professor Johnson, do you want to take a go?
I'll jump in. Unless, Arlene, did you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
So, I mean, I think I already kind of asked on a side answer to one of the questions, which is how do we think about this sort of marginalization and systemic, not systemic disinvestment of communities. And I mentioned to whoever asked the question that redlining hasn't stopped, it's continued. And that in fact, in this kind of neoliberal moment, it has turned into almost predatory extraction. And so I think that one of the things that I would say that we need to do is really think about and address these mechanisms of predatory extraction, but also think about mechanisms to secure folks who want to live and stay in their communities and grow their communities in a way that fits their needs. So I'd say that that's one answer to I think one of the questions. I think the second question is, how do we think about change in majority white communities? I'm currently in upstate New York in a highly majority white county. And one of the interesting things has been this sort of range of Black Lives Matter protest or marches in solidarity of it, which I think is really interesting and totally unexpected. And so I think, is that enough? No, but I think it is a sign of something, the sort of widespread realization that this moment is a moment of change and that the sort of status quo cannot remain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I also think, the question about white communities, it's so important. I don't know if the person who's writing, who asked the question herself if they're also white or what background they are, but it brings attention to the fact that this is all of us, right? Mm-hmm. The key element here is to realize the centrally, the class dimensions, right? Because this is really about, when you think about race and racism, it's about inequality ultimately. That we use race to sort of think about inequality, but at the root of it all is inequality. Is the fact that, right now, there is the whole society needs better policing, better healthcare, better housing, and economic accountability. And I think that would be the kind of key element, because right now a lot of the discussion around race erases dimensions of class. Mm-hmm. that can be the space for solidarity for all communities, right? And I think that's the what I would say to white communities is to begin to become educated about how, in fact, racism doesn't help anyone, and in fact, we should all be together creating alliances for more just societies, so that all of us, right, so that we could all have more fair and more equitable society that will benefit everyone. Right now, the conversation around race, it becomes this kind of like race war, the kind of white nationalism where people just like, right, you get pride for being white, but you're not getting healthcare. How do we begin to kind of like tease that out so that we could really get to the issues that all of us should be fighting for?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Professor Sagru, you want to jump in? You're muted, so if you wanted to jump in.
Yes. I agree with the last two comments very strongly. I'll answer the white question quickly, which is to say that whites need to be part of institutions that are led by, speak for, and organized by people of color. Segregation exacts a very high cost in terms of mobilization for political change, and whites are the most segregated group in American society. They're most likely to interact with other whites, live in neighborhoods that are white majority, attend schools from kindergarten all the way through universities in white dominated institutions. And it's critical for whites to have the exposure and experience, but not the notion of speaking for people who are not white, but listening to people who are not white. I think that's crucial. We can educate and we must educate, but we need to go further than that. If folks don't have experience, education will only take them so far. As far as wealth goes, I would totally agree with Kim that we need to come up with public policies that challenge and disrupt various forms of predation that disproportionately affect communities of color. That would be predatory lending, that would be predatory renting, and the rental crisis is profound in the United States right now. That would be employment that is underpaid, without benefits, and insecure, just to name three. We need to focus on those forms of predation and exploitation if we're going to get at the nub of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Segru. And just want to encourage you all to keep the questions coming in. We're trying to get to as many as we can. As we said, we still have several hundred people that have dialed in, and we're so grateful that you are a part of this conversation with us this evening. We still are taking questions. We have about 15 more minutes before we wrap up. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that we've heard this evening, and just highlight a few key points related to the interconnectedness and the intersectional approach that we really have to think about as we address the problems and issues that Professor Davila, Professor Segru, and Professor Johnson have raised this evening. And I also want to just give a special recognition, Dr. Lisa Coleman, she's on the line, who is our Senior VP of Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation. And that office is doing wonderful work. I'm a part of the office leading faculty engagement and innovation, and we have a wonderful resource on anti-racism education, programming, et cetera. So I encourage you all to use that as a resource. I think one of the things I heard each of you saying tonight is the importance of making sure that each of us understands our role in what's happening now in American society, that we each need to develop a learning plan and a plan of action. So please visit that website and take advantage of those resources that are available, the Office of Global Inclusion. We're excited that you're dialing in this evening, and I want to get to our next question, which I think fits very nicely into this conversation, and it highlights what we've seen all throughout social media, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, Facebook. Our question that has come in is actually a couple of them, and I'm going to try to combine them if I may. But the question centers around how now more and more on social media, we're hearing current and past accounts from Black and Indigenous students, as well as people of color in general, sharing about their experience at predominantly white institutions. And many of them are naming experiences as well as faculty members that they've encountered. And so the questions that we have coming in center on what are recommendations that you have to educational communities about what needs to be done in terms of creating accountability and academic policies that promote true diversity and inclusion. So what can we do really to have higher educational institutions really promote accountability while simultaneously creating policies in ways of creating communities that are truly inclusive and diverse? So that's the couple of the questions that we have coming in this evening. And any of you can jump in.
I am familiar with a lot of the hashtags. Probably there's a Change the Museum in Instagram, which is so illuminating if anybody has a chance to look at them. And all the hashtags I mentioned, Black in the Ivory, all of them are really so informative. And I think that any administrators and institutions need to read these accounts, right, to understand, because these accounts often they're coming to light in a way that, right, people are speaking out openly about experiences of racism. Today, there was a fantastic editorial in the Washington Post. I forget about Eddie Bolton, I think, which is in finance, 80-year-old, somebody, one of the few Black finance, talking about like what it is to be in this industry as an African-American owner of this financial industry. And these stories are so important for us to like, kind of like, people are speaking out loud, you know, about these experiences. But then it goes the question of what then now, right? Like, it's kind of frustrating because you get the stories and people like, okay, this is it. But then what, how do we change this? And how do we move forward? Which is kind of like the key element, right? When curators and people of power, like the editorial today in the Washington Post, even people of power, Black professionals in power experience racism, right? What does that tell you about how entrenched structural racism it is in society and in these industries, right? That even the people that are at the pinnacle of these industries are experiencing and sharing the stories of racism, right? So I want to go back to what I said earlier is to empower yourself, right? You're a young person, you are the future, and you need to be very empowered about your value and what you have to offer, and to not let anyone detain you, and ensure that you seek mentors that help you and promote you, because there's a lot of us who want to see you succeed. So that's kind of what I would say. What I would say is that I would like to think that we are in a big paradigm shift, and that what we're going to see from now onwards is for all institutions to really transform themselves, and that they will not, there could be policies such as, we have talked about it in several departments, let's ensure that we do not hire more faculty unless we can hire at least 2 or 3 Black faculty in our department, for instance. We could make policies like that. We could choose to be really proactive. And I think that we need to be very daring right now about how we hire, who we hire, where we look at talent, who we promote, who in these positions of leadership, so that because I have all the faith that if you bring people in these positions of leadership, they'll change the conversation. They will hire new people. They will have new narratives. They will create new exhibitions. They will create new programming. They will teach new courses. So that's kind of like what I think. I have enormous hope for all the incredible creatives and professionals of color and my Black colleagues who are taking leadership positions, that change can come with their leadership.
All right, thank you so much there, and we are running short on time. I want us, if we can, get in one more question.
Can I just one little thing
Sure, jump in, please.
As a parent of a high schooler I'm incredibly awed and amazed, who has taken a lead in these conversations on Instagram. I am amazed at this generation in terms of their leadership, in terms of being really specific about disciplinary issues, about curriculum issues, and naming names and naming times, and really putting their administration's feet through the fire and demanding change. And I am incredibly awed and amazed and proud of this generation. So I think we have a lot to sort of hope for in terms of using their words, which is what every parent wants their child to do, to use their words and really push for change. So
yes, and to that end, 2 questions, and I'm going to try to make it's 1 question, but it's 2 parts. And if you all could each reflect on this and include this as a part of your closing remarks, if you could just take 2 minutes each. I'd love for you to also share your social media contact so that we can continue this conversation. I think, as you all can tell from the interest this evening, this is something that we are all really trying to address and be proactive and thoughtful in what we do. And so I have a 2-part question that I'd like you to think about as you make your closing comments. 1 question talks about cost-specific policies and how that's particularly redirected towards marginalized community. And the question highlights how often we raise the issue of how much will it cost? But the question really is, how much will it cost if we do not enact these policy changes? So if you can talk about what it means to address issues if we don't enact these policy changes. And then the next part of that question that I'd like you to give some thought to is the process of transformational change. What does it really look like to have a paradigm shift? What are the short-term and long-term ways of thinking about really leveraging this transformative moment? What is really required in terms of what we need to do as a community? And so I'm going to direct that to each of you. Why don't we start in the order in terms of where we presented? Professor Segru, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Professor Johnson and Professor Davila and do some wrap up.
Really big questions. So let me just say that when it comes to public policy, when it comes to work, cheap is expensive. That is, by underpaying workers. We add huge costs to their lives and societal costs as well. The inadequacy of our underfunded system of public education, particularly inadequate for students of color, leads to generations of accumulated disadvantage. The fact that precarity in our housing markets leads to enormous gaps in household wealth comes at a very high cost to the benefit of a relatively small segment of the population. So we need, in thinking about assessing our public policies, to think about where those costs are, how high they are, and to shift our priorities toward them.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Sugrue. Professor Johnson.
I think what I would say is that we need to think about what does it mean to have a just city? What does it mean to have a just society? And part of asking that question is to really reject the notion of costs, right? Because under a cost accounting system, some people will always lose, right? And so instead of asking, is it going to cost too much? And putting it as, if we don't spend on X, then something bad will happen. How about thinking about spending because that's the right thing to do? It's the just thing to do. And so I think we really, really need to reject what I would call this neoliberal sort of cost accounting way of thinking about how we live in society, that we should do things not because there's a cost benefit analysis attached to it, but really because this is the right thing to do. So again, I think that's what I would argue, that we need to really think about what is the right thing to do and how do we get to that moment, and not necessarily think about can we afford it, because it turns out we can afford a lot of things. It's just a choice of what we decide to spend on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Johnson. Professor Davila.
Absolutely. I'll just say that if you are in a museum, art, culture, publishing, media, or university, any kind of knowledge or art related, cultural related industry, and you're not centering people of color, you are not going to be ready to face the future. Your industry is not going to be forward thinking. It's impossible. So I think that it's just a matter of these industries. I don't think any of these industries are sustainable unless they realize that the demographics of the United States has changed, and that this kind of like white museum, all canonical space, white publishing, none of that. It's gone. Let's face it. So the sooner we realize that, and same with traditional disciplines, and I'm going to be very, I'm going to be, also, there's so many disciplines, like political science, philosophy, sociology, where they have no people of color. They are so behind what ethnic studies and critical race studies is doing. So I do think that we are in a moment of a paradigm shift. And if you want to be forward-thinking, successful, and innovative, you won't be able to do it unless you change how you think and the demographics of your industry, and you center people of color and Black voices as the core creative agents of your industry.
Wonderful. And I would just thank you all so much. And before we wrap up and end our time together this evening, I just want to thank each of you for the phenomenal work that you do, for your pioneering research. I want to encourage our audience to engage with you on Twitter and on social media. Please, please, please reach out to our faculty here. They are very accessible. I encourage you to read their work. They are doing really innovative work and research, and we're really fortunate to have them in conversation with us this evening. So I again want to thank you, Professor Sugrue, you, Professor Johnson, and you, Professor Davila, for being with us this evening. And before we wrap up, I just want to do a few closing announcements and just invite you all to really stay engaged. We do have in the next few weeks some updates about CCII's Twitter handle and their website. It's coming soon. And we do want you to be on the lookout for future webinars on areas such as race, art, and activism, as well as leadership, advocacy, and organizing. These are really important areas. We're so fortunate that so many of you joined the call this evening. We want you to be on Twitter and definitely hashtag NYU Race Forward. Make sure that's a part of your engagement. I really want to also thank so many people that made this evening possible. With the CCII initiative, the leadership, Dr. Sibel Raver, the Deputy Provost, Dr. Ellen Shaw, Senior Presidential Fellow, and Dr. Michael Lindsley, who is the Executive Director of the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. And I especially want to thank Dr. Caroline Dorson, who is a faculty member at the Myers College of Nursing. She has been the lead organizer of the CCII webinar series and has really done a lot of work behind the scenes. And we have a whole team of people at NYU. So you all know who you are. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your work in making this all seamless this evening. We're so grateful for you. And I just want to say, please, for all of you who dialed in this evening, stay tuned for future programming that we have with CCII. There's so much information and resources that we plan to have available for you. I want to encourage you in terms of proactive steps. Think about what this means for you. Do you have a learning plan? Do you have a plan of action? We have resources, as I mentioned, through the Office of Global Inclusion as well, our anti-racism education resources and programs. One of the articles we highlight is on undoing anti-Black racism, 5 things that you can do today. So there's work you can do right now that you can think about in terms of being proactive. And we want you to stay engaged with CCII in the work that they're doing. We plan to have future opportunities for community engagement. And we really want to thank each of you for being a part of our conversation this evening. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will continue to be supportive of our work and have a great evening. And remember, keep up the work, create a plan of action, engage, and really do all that you can do to bring about positive transformation change. Have a great evening, and thank you.